Story 1. A class about progressive education techniques where, at the end of the semester, you grade yourself. I got an A+. Story 2. Most useless but most fun. I took a course on the history of dress thinking I might be the only man in a course full of women, but they put it online at the last minute and it was just a group of men who had the same idea as me. We bonded, and I had much more fun learning about the practicalities of fashion than I imagined I would. However, my knowledge of codpieces has never been needed since. Story 3. General Studies. I wrote an essay about morality in Neighbours, the Australian soap opera. I received an A. Story 4. Bowling. We had to take a physical education elective, so twice a week we went to the campus bowling alley. A man straight out of the 1970s wearing a wide lapel polyester leisure suit would give about 20 minutes of pointers on improving your game. Then he would return for a few highballs while the class played 8 or 10 frames. Story 5. How to teach science in elementary school. The professor was ancient and could not be bothered with more than, take your students into the woods. Story 6. Civil engineering course in musical acoustics. My team constructed a flute made mostly of ice. Definitely a great course, but I have not had much use for this knowledge since. Story 7. The most useless class I passed was Introduction to Geology, but at least I learned the rock cycle. Story 8. Every one of them ended up being useless because I studied engineering but went into finance. If I had to pick the most useless, it would be religion in media. I went to a Catholic school that required us to take a few religion-focused classes. Story 9. ActionScript in Adobe Flash. I had no idea what I was doing, but Adobe Flash was popular in those days. It was an interesting time in web development. Story 10. University 101. It was just a cash grab in the general education courses. You were forced to take it as a freshman, and all it really was get to know the university. Literally, you got graded by attending university events. I could have done that myself if I actually wanted to. Story 11. A class about the experience of college. Think of the class like corporate compliance training you have to complete. The class was 1 credit. Story 12. It was called Student Success. The content was basically how to be a college student and included topics such as textbooks contain information and you should take notes. It seemed as if the university forgot we had all been through high school rather recently. Story 13. History of Architecture. My advisor did not tell me it was a weed-out class for architecture students, and I was not an architecture student. It was obnoxiously stressful and useless to me. The class that on paper seemed useless but was really interesting and enriching was History of Popular Music. I got a lot out of that class. I do not remember anything from History of Architecture. Story 14. The class was called Digital Engineering. It involved the professor giving weekly presentations about his pet project, which was an evolutionary algorithm-based design optimization method. It could have been interesting, except it only consisted of him boasting about how great he was, and there was basically nothing you actually learned from his lecture. Story 15. Some kinesiology class. I went at the meeting time and I was the only one there. I sat for 20 minutes, then left. I called the coach and he said it did not meet at all. It turned out to be a fake class, a grade point average booster class for the sports groups. Story 16. Introduction to Physical Fitness. There was no actual class. You just showed up at the college gym twice a week and signed the sign-in sheet. I would just go before my 8 o'clock classes. Story 17. Medical Ethics. A class I was very excited for, but it turned out the professor was a hardcore Christian fanatic. Story 18. It doesn't really matter because my state just eliminated hundreds of entire degree programs, so those useless classes are no longer an option. I think one state-run university alone dropped 250 different full degree programs. Story 19. None of the classes I took were useless. My degree was Bachelor of Science in Biophysics, and even after leaving laboratory work, I have learned that they taught me how to think as an interdisciplinary scientist, which has been enormously helpful in my fiction writing and simply existing in a science-driven information economy. Many political or social issues that Americans find intractable are actually easy to solve once you apply evidence-based programs, systems-integrated thinking, and basic logic, from climate change to gun control to abortion. Unfortunately, once you appreciate how simple most of society's problems actually are when thought of scientifically, you realize how few people think this way, and how most of our society and people's daily lives run on unexamined misinformation. The other liberal arts requirements I completed included courses on Zen, information science, gender theory, African history, French language, and more. These have all been useful in understanding myself, my world, and my fellow humans. In America, college education is a privilege and an expensive one. You should not waste even a day or an hour of your time there. It will be one of the greatest learning and personal growth opportunities of your life. Do not waste it. If you work hard, you will create for yourself a lifestyle of personal growth and continuing education, and if you continue to follow this path beyond graduation, it will reward you for life. Story 20. Introduction to Innovation Through Technology. Why? It was like business history, absolutely nothing else. I was pursuing a bachelor's degree in microbiology and physiology. Story 21. I took two classes that I found useless, and I had very different opinions about both. I believe every class has value depending on the field you are entering, but these were not helpful for my interests. The first class was art history. It was useless for my major but useful for my hobbies. I enjoyed the class a lot. The homework was light, one essay per month, about 1,000 words. In lectures, we mainly watched videos. It was a relaxed class held at 5 p.m., which helped me wind down after a busy day. I would happily retake it if given the option. I passed with an A. The second class was a business class. It was useless for both my major and my interests. I only took it for honors credit. It was very difficult and time-consuming. I spent more time writing essays for this class than for two of my major core classes combined. I passed with an A, but given the effort I put in, I honestly deserved a C. I am a pre-med student. Story 22. Mathematics. Apart from the fact that it was not my favorite or best class, I had to go through years of material I never used afterward. Sure, adding, contractions, even Pythagoras and pi sometimes, but making a hyperbole? Trigonometry. It did not help that most teachers could not explain in any other way than the books already did, which was exactly the way that did not help. On the other hand, I did fine with all formulas when applied, like in economics and geography. Maybe it was just too abstract in mathematics. Story 23. How to teach reading. The professor said all knowledge was related. Then he proceeded from his assertion to talk about golf and his golf trips. He banned us from using laptops during his class. We were supposed to hear him talk about golf. He is well respected in his field. Story 24. Differential equations. I received a D, which was a passing grade for my catalog year. I had to take it for my engineering degree, but I never have and highly suspect I never will use anything I might have learned in that class. Story 25. Sociology and philosophy. I know these are two classes, but I can't choose one over the other. At least the philosophy professor was passionate, so it was mildly enjoyable, despite the material being somewhat useless. The sociology professor was clearly only there for the salary. There were over 480 students enrolled in the class, but he never had more than 20 students actually present at his lectures. Story 26. I thought it was useless, but I ended up really enjoying it and learning a lot. History of the Middle East. I highly recommend it if you need a history class. Story 27. The Freshman Orientation Seminar. I do not care about campus culture or staying involved. I have work to do for my other classes. We did meditation for one period, and I fell asleep during the meditation because I am a college student. It was a waste of credits and grades. Story 28. Acting workshop at Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, the same place where Hugh Jackman studied. It was an elective. 50% of the mark was just turning up. Participation was not required, but the feedback I received was, "You are a decent actor if you were not joking all the time." The only reason I enrolled was that I spent most of my afternoons in the university tavern getting drunk, so I needed a class where I could sober up before driving home. Story 29. When you say college, I assume that is the same as university in Australia. We studied how to design green screen applications and write common business-oriented language. I never used either skill, and as far as I know, no one in my degree ever did. Those lessons were laborious. Story 30. The Business of Madonna. It was a class about Madonna from a business and marketing perspective. Very interesting and changed the way I viewed celebrity. Story 31. World Development. I only took it because I needed to fill 2 hours a week. I learned a bit about various topics, but nothing I have ever used in my daily life. Story 32. Classics. It has not been remotely useful for anything. This was the only classics course that I ever took. However, I have continued to read ancient Greek drama and the epics in translation. The course also introduced me to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, something I have essentially never stopped reading or learning about. It has all been useless. But utility, narrowly considered, is not necessarily the most important feature of a class. Conceived narrowly as labor market training, none of this was useful. However, that one class has really contributed to my quality of life. Regardless of its uselessness, I would not change anything if given the opportunity to do it again. Story 33. Analytical chemistry is the one I have used the least. Possibly the reason why most of my missed class or test nightmares involve a chemistry class at my undergraduate institution. Keep in mind I am a librarian at a public library and have used general and organic chemistry in answering patron questions multiple times. Story 34. Spanish. Not because Spanish is useless, but the teacher was absolutely incompetent. I learned more in the first 5 minutes of Duolingo than in the whole semester. My Spanish teacher was just an old woman speaking Spanish and repeating words multiple times. I knew a little Spanish, but she introduced herself, the lessons, and her whole life story right from the start in very fast, mumbling Spanish with a thick dialect. She switched back to explain, "Yeah, that's my dialect. I'm proud of it and won't change, so get used to it." Then she returned to fast Spanish. If you had a question, she told you very aggressively to use Spanish, and if you managed to stumble through a sentence with your notes or Google, she corrected you very aggressively, especially how to pronounce the R, and answered the question in Spanish again very fast. She wrote nothing, only spoke. She did some vocabulary, but other than that, it was a waste of time. Story 35. My colleague failed sociology 2 years in a row at the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering in Zagreb. That was 4 exams over 2 years. He ended up giving up on his education in mechanical engineering and never completed any other university degree. He had a technical mind and would have been an amazing engineer, but sociology was obligatory, and he could not force himself to learn such mundane subjects, in his opinion. Story 36. I took a class on Russian folklore and fairy tales. The main takeaway from this class was that the stories serve as warnings to children, advising them not to enter dark forests or play in stagnant water. Story 37. Music Appreciation 301. I already appreciated it, so it was like a pub quiz since it was a televised class. Not only did I get an A, but the entire room of people working together also did. Story 38. Cooking. I already cooked daily with I expected that the class would include a science part to really understand how ingredients work together. We cooked pasta in almost every class with different types of sauces. We were required to do the catering for our school's summer festival. However, I did not learn anything new. Even worse, I was actively discouraged from applying my cooking knowledge to modify the sauce recipes occasionally. It was the easiest A+ of my school years, but very boring. Story 39. Technically all of them because I have never used any of my degrees. At the time, I definitely took fundamentals of music to fulfill course credits and balance out the 3 harder subjects that semester. Story 40. An online aerobic walking class focused on power walking and race walking. Believe it or not, that class was actually very challenging. Quizzes and group projects were included. Story 41. Music Appreciation. Technically the only college class I passed, but it still counts. It was basics of music, some information about classical composers, that sort of thing. I actually really liked it, and the grades were basically showing up and doing the final, which was held in class and not some kind of research paper. It was really just an easy elective, and that is why I chose it. But like I said, I actually liked it, and that surprised me more than it probably should have. My parents raised my siblings and me to have a broad music taste and enjoy singing. Being the youngest, I was not able to join the band because we had to rent or buy the instrument, and my mom developed health issues before I got to be that old. Story 42. Human Resources. I had been working in human resources for about 6 months, and everything they taught was outdated and useless. Interestingly, I initially failed that class because I argued with the teacher who was sharing information valid about 35 years ago. I kept correcting her. She asked me to leave the class and told me not to return. I did not go back. Instead, I attended the reevaluation session during summer finals and passed with an A. I still work in the field 6 years later, and that class is even more outdated now. Story 43. As a foreign student, I was required to take English as a second language. My argument that I spoke English as a first language and had done so from when I could speak was rejected. I did ace it, but it was time I could have used for other things. Story 44. I'm not totally sure it was useless, but Introduction to Animatronics was pretty challenging for me. It was taught by my favorite professor, so I took it because it sounded fun. We did a lot of building with different robotics parts such as servos and remote controls. Will I use that knowledge later? Probably not, but it was fun while it lasted. For my final project, I built a working Rock'em Sock'em Robots project. Story 45. Communications class. Never used the expensive textbook but reinforced the basic knowledge of how to write an email I already had. I do not remember much else from that class. Story 46. Not college, but when I was in year 9 we had etiquette. It was useless because nothing ever happened in these classes. In the end, the only reason I remember the etiquette exam so well is that I was late for it. Story 47. Introduction to Art or Introduction to Music. Both were mandatory and topics I learned in first grade. I was required to pay $5,000 to learn what an orchestra is or that art can be whatever you set your mind to. Story 48. Humanities 1010 had absolutely nothing to do with my future career. It was basically just art appreciation. However, it was also crucial in helping me decide that college wasn't so bad and that I would see it through, so I don't know if that counts. Statistics, if not. I disliked statistics. I hated the material and regretted signing up to take it on a Saturday morning. I also disliked the location of the classroom on campus. I hated writing long paragraphs for every problem. I never used statistics in my day-to-day life, not at all. Story 49. Almost all of them. They had nothing to do with what I wanted to learn or were repeated material I learned in high school. The American education system needs to seriously revamp its higher learning. Story 50. I had a class about music appreciation. Most of it covered the medieval era. One day, we went into the art classroom and painted what we were feeling based on the sounds we heard. Another time, we went outside and completed the same assignment, but we only recorded the sounds. It was a boring and dull experience for 2 hours, Monday through Thursday, since it was a summer class. Story 51. Not useless, as it has generated many great conversations over the years, but niche. Anthropology of food and eating. It started with kosher and halal traditions, but then shifted to the professor's area of expertise, American fast food chains in China. Niche, as I said, but very fascinating. For example, some schools take young children there, so they can start practicing eating Western cuisines like hamburgers if they become international businessmen. Some franchises hire former Nepalese Army Special Forces members as bouncers to ensure triad members do not stay in the establishment for too long. Story 52. I had a class about peer-to-peer technologies, which was great since my dorm had a rule about only using the Wi-Fi for school activities. Story 53. Philosophy. I legitimately slept through it. The professor was very intelligent but had a monotone banker's voice. I always felt bad. Story 54. I had to pass a course that could be summarized as how to use the internet. Some background. Do not cite the dark magic to me, which I was there when it was written. I helped build 2 dial-up internet service providers from the ground up in the 1990s. I also helped build one of the first wireless broadband internet service providers when that was not yet common. I worked at Yahoo when it was actually popular before the first dot-com bubble burst. I say this not to brag, but to say, I know how the internet works. Because I could not present artifacts of how I learned these things, I was ineligible to receive credit. I talked to my professor the first week and asked, "Can you just give me the final exam now and call it done?" They said no, I needed to complete all the requirements. It was a waste of my time, but I took some pleasure in fact-checking the inaccuracies in the coursework. A very close second was my required class on ethics, in which the professor spent the entire semester discussing psychoanalysis, which has nothing to do with ethics. The syllabus changed 3 times during the semester, including about 4 weeks before the end. Several of us complained to the department chair and said, "If we don't get A's in this, there will be consequences." We got A's. Story 55. Physical Geography. I had to take it for my geosciences minor. Nothing was wrong with the class, but I had learned everything in it and more when I took earth sciences a year before. The professor kept saying, "But we won't go into that in this course." And I was just sitting there thinking, can we go into that? That sounds interesting. Story 56. World Religions. I never benefited in any way from it. In fact, the instructor refused to believe that I had written my own paper because I was more advanced than most of his students. I was furious with him. I presented him with the books I had cited and demanded that he show me what he thought I plagiarized. He backed down and would not touch any of them. On the other hand, he never apologized for his false accusation either. Story 57. Positive psychology was taught like a self-help multi-level marketing recruitment class. If you want good things, just imagine good things happening to you, a kind of superficial, unrealistic approach. Our final exam was a test on the movie Eat, Pray, Love. I wish I were making this up. Story 58. Swimming for non-swimmers. It sounds like I went to Greendale, but it was, in fact, a real elective class that counted towards my necessary physical education credits. It was almost 20 years ago, but if I remember correctly, it taught the fundamentals of why swimming works, how floating works, and what certain flotation devices were used for, all while never being near an actual pool. There was also introduction to rollerblading, but that was a bit tougher as we had to disassemble and reassemble our skates, do a lap forward, half a lap backward, and a T-stop. Story 59. I needed a science credit for a breadth requirement, and at that point I was just trying to get my degree as soon as possible. My university offered courses that could be taken remotely via local access cable. I chose a course on paleontology, which I already knew quite a bit about, to earn an easy credit. I called it TV Dinosaurs. Story 60. Gold panning. I was one California State University credit shy of my transfer and was flipping through the summer catalog. I saw a class that was 1 unit, 3 days, and transferable to California State University. It was a class on gold panning in the Sierra Nevada mountains. 1 day in the class was spent learning about the 1849 gold rush history, and 2 days were spent sitting in a creek, just panning for gold in a beautiful river. I found a few flakes, which I have in a jar somewhere. Shout out to Columbia College up in the Sierra Nevada. It has a beautiful campus. I spent 2 years there earning an Associate of Science in Forestry and just walking in the woods. Story 61. Introduction to post-war Italian film, also known as Tuesday Night at the Movies with Signora. It was excellent. We watched Fellini, De Sica, and Rossellini films. I was unaware of history until then. I had a very superficial understanding of geopolitical conflict. Embarrassingly naive at 22 in a prestigious school. I actually learned a great deal about Italian history, culture, and most importantly, film. It was considered an easy class and I scored a B+, which I probably did not deserve. However, it made me think and observe in a non-scientific way, the basis for enjoying art in general. It seemed useless at the time, but lifelong film appreciation was not. Calculus 2, however, when will I need to know the volume of a torus and imaginary numbers? Hopefully never, because I could not if my life depended on it. Story 62. Religion 115. 6 tests for the entire semester. All archived in test banks. Memorize the 10 answers on each test and 25 for the final. Get an A and 5 credits. Story 63. Baroque art. I enjoyed the class, which was taught by a graduate student. She would display a painting with the name, artist, and the year it was painted, and we would openly discuss the painting as a class. For the final, she showed us paintings on the smart screen, and we had to identify the name, artist, and year. Then we had to say something about each painting. There were also a few bonus questions. I ended up getting a score of 117 on the final. Story 64. I had a few courses, probably either an introductory theater and acting class or two different major world religion surveys, which were interesting. Probably the worst was architecture in film. I dislike the general humanities requirements as they feel like a waste. Story 65. I had to take Physics 2 for veterinary school. All we learned in that course was how to set up circuits. You know what was not a prerequisite? Any of my animal nutrition classes. Story 66. Independent study in theater. The only two requirements to pass were to do something theater-related this semester, which I was planning to do anyway, and to write a 5-page paper about the experience, due on the last day of finals for the semester. I completed the paper in an hour or two. Not a bad class by any means, but also not that useful as a class. Story 67. Saltwater fishing was one of my physical education electives, and I had a great time. The final was a trip on a boat to fish. However, have I used this in my daily life? Not once since taking the course 15 years ago. Story 68. Saltwater fishing was one of my physical education electives, and I had a great time. The final was a trip on a boat to fish. However, I have not used this skill in my daily life since taking the course 15 years ago. Story 69. The application of political science to music is interesting but has never been applied in real life. I took a 16-week course on the myth of Orpheus, which was fun but not really practical. Also, Maine studies involved visiting random places in Maine and writing about them, which was cool, but again, why? Story 70. Art history is not a history class or an art class, but rather the history of art. This was a required class before I could take my marine biology courses. The cost was $800 for the class, $200 for a textbook we never opened, and I had to take a mandatory day off work to visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art and take pictures of everything to prove I went. Story 71. Stress reduction and wellness. It was just an hour a week of guided meditation and light stretching. It was only offered pass or fail, and the pass was purely based on attendance. Story 72. A geography class focused on my specific state turned out to be more of a world geology class. I learned more about the water cycle, igneous rock, sedimentary rock, and the landscape from over 3 billion years ago than anything related to the actual geography of the state where I live. I much preferred my anthropology of religion class, which was another easy class. I ended up really enjoying it and developed a new appreciation for different religions around the world. Story 73. Walking, we just walked around a track for 40 minutes after signing in on an unmoderated sign-in sheet. Most people just signed in and left. Story 74. Health 101. The course was required for education majors, and our school's softball coach, who taught no other class, was the teacher. Many athletes took her class because it was an easy grade. The content covered basic health information taught in junior high and high school and felt like a waste of time, especially since it was an 8 a.m. class. Additionally, there was inappropriate joking about sexually transmitted diseases and other sexual topics that, in my opinion, should not be joked about. Story 75. The class was called Ecotopia. It was an English literature elective. We read the book Ecotopia and then wrote a 1-page paper about it. We worked in teams. The book was not very good. Story 76. Paranormal psychology involves the study of phenomena such as ghosts, unidentified flying objects, and cryptids. However, it lacks a scientific psychological basis. Story 77. Keyboarding for non-majors. I had to take an extra semester of just irrelevant credit classes to meet the total credit requirements for my computer science degree. I ended up writing a program to scan the book we had to type from and type it out at a variable words per minute rate, and then I had to do all my work for me. Honestly, the class would have been useful for me as an extremely slow typer if I had done the work instead of cheating. But I was upset that I had to do a whole extra semester of college over 7 generic credit hours missing from my requirements. I was close with the department chair, who let me complete 5 credit hours of independent study remotely. However, that was the limit she could allow. Story 78. Astronomy. 3 lectures per week with multiple choice tests. Previous tests were available in the library. Attendance was primarily for taking tests. Story 79. Introduction to basketball. I needed a slight grade point average boost to get into a program I wanted to join. The class consisted of us going to the gym and playing pickup basketball for an hour. You were only graded on attendance. Story 80. I had to take an introduction to electronics class. It was the hardest class I have ever taken, and I barely passed. I have not had to solder any circuit boards since then. Story 81. Physical anthropology was enjoyable, and I learned a lot about identifying various bones and how to conduct an anthropology dig. However, since I did not become an anthropologist, it had very little real-world application. Story 82. Underwater archaeology was an easy but entertaining class, especially if you enjoy the History Channel or documentaries. The professor conducted dives at archaeological sites and was an excellent presenter. The class was straightforward. There were 4 tests during the semester, each with 25 questions, and each question was worth 1 point. 10 questions on each test involved identifying pictures from the textbook, making it very manageable to pass. Story 83. Career counseling for a Master of Mental Health. The idea is not bad, but the subject matter was written by an older professor who refused to let anyone else revise it. Did you know people are happier with jobs that pay them enough to survive? Did you know people whose families went to college probably also went to college? How about this? Better work-life balance is good. My favorite part was when we had to look back through our family history about 3 or 4 generations and say what they did and where they went to college. Some of the Boston natives in my class loved seeing that people in their family have always pursued their dreams and valued education. Meanwhile, I, a poor white person from the South, and a black friend of mine had to remind everyone that most people do not have the opportunity to do what they are talking about. My grandparents were sharecroppers, and my friend's great-great-grandparents were slaves. It was a waste of time that ignored both people's life realities and the current environment. Story 84. The class was taught by a person with a strong accent, making it difficult for anyone to understand what he was saying. I do not even remember now what the class was. Story 85. African theater. I had heard it was pretty much the easiest course. We were required to see a play at my university that was relevant, and it ended up being really good. Story 86. Funny how, 40 years later, the only classes I still think about were the just need the credit classes. Comparative religion, history of the horror novel. Story 87. Great works of literature. I was disadvantaged by receiving a late registration date for classes, and there were not many options left that were not full. I read The Art of War as my personal choice and gave a presentation about it. Story 88. Yoga. 9 a.m. class full of hungover girls snoring in a smelly wrestling room. I am a male. Badminton. 3 Asian children aim to hit everyone on the forehead during the game. History of cinema. Watched a few minutes of a classic movie in a room that held about 400 students and had to remember small details for the final exam. Statistics. Not useless, but I scored 30% on the final exam. The grade curve was poor, yet I ended up with a B+. Teaching assistants taught us enough to complete the homework, but not to pass the final exam. Story 89. Well, I work a job that has nothing to do with my degree, so technically all of them. That being said, I have no regrets. My major, journalism, taught me a lot of soft skills that are very useful in the business world, so it has helped me nonetheless. Story 90. Business and administrative law in law school was a dry class. The professor was ineffective, and I learned nothing applicable to my legal work. Due to the timing of my attendance, much of the material was obsolete by the time I graduated or shortly after. However, it was a required class, as it was the only regulatory intensive course that fit my schedule. Story 91. I took 2 interdisciplinary studies courses. The professor seemed distracted. We discussed self-actualization and read a book that was mostly adult content with a minimal plot. There were no mandatory papers or tests. Class participation was the main metric assessed. It was an affordable community college. Story 92. Any of my mandatory physical education classes, especially walk, jog, run, a class whose purpose I feel is self-explanatory. I am generally okay with all the electives you have to take in college. I did not mind sitting through biology, philosophy, psychology, human communication, and other classes irrelevant to my major that were there to make me a more well-rounded student. If anything, it is good since most of those were easy A's that protected my grade point average from advanced macroeconomics and other difficult classes. However, in my opinion, physical education being mandatory in college, except for a sports medicine major or similar, is absolutely ridiculous and a complete waste of my time and tuition money. Story 93. Introduction to College Mathematics, mainly because the professor teaching kept confusing herself. Thank God it was a hybrid class. Most of the class was on Farmville while she tried to figure out a formula. Story 94. Geology. I needed a science credit for some reason, so I took this course. The professor was absolutely incredible, and the labs were very enjoyable, but I cannot remember any information from the course. Story 95. Philosophy of religion. I was expelled from class for looking into the soul of the girl next to me during an exam. Story 96. I took a class on Elvis. I thought it would focus on the history of the time, exploring Elvis's life, the turmoil of the 1960s, and what was happening in the world. No, it was just about Elvis. A whole semester spent learning how Elvis used twinning in his movies, such as looking in a mirror, because his twin died at birth. There was allegedly an attendance requirement, but an acquaintance who almost never attended classes received the same grade as me. I am still bitter about that, and it was about 30 years ago. Story 97. Recital attendance. It was a requirement for my major every semester to attend 10 qualifying performances in our Performing Arts Center. They scanned student identification cards before and after the performance to ensure actual attendance. Tickets were not included in tuition and had to be purchased separately. Story 98. I had a mixed media art class in my junior year of college where the professor gave everyone straight A grades. She assigned really cool projects and was very encouraging throughout all our work. It didn't matter if the project was good or not. Everyone received a grade of 100. Years later, I was talking with a professor friend of mine in a completely different field. She said she was pretty much begged to teach a class slightly outside her focus. She resisted at first, so they offered her extra money to teach it. I think this happened with my professor as well. I believe it was an extra credit course for her, and she was just taking the paycheck. She encouraged us to explore art in our projects. One time, I made a video montage of interesting scenes around my city. I built a screen to show it on that had its own design, and then at the last minute decided to put a green, metallic, opaque film over the whole screen. The video ended up reflecting a bunch of moving colors off the screen and onto the ceiling and walls. She acted like it was amazing, and I just calmly acted like that was supposed to happen. You couldn't see anything that was happening in the video. I got a grade of 100. Story 99. I took a history of rock music class. We listened to rock music from various eras and discussed it. Although it seemed unproductive, the professor was a true hippie who played guitar for several famous musicians over the years, including Janis Joplin. That was pretty cool. Story 100. My university required us to take 2 arts classes for a business general management degree. I took film studies for one. I feel like this is a common need to fill an arts requirement plus it's easy class. The second was a class called Exploring Creativity. The class description was something along the lines of exploring creativity via different mediums. The class was 3 hours on a Saturday morning, from 9 to noon. I can tell you that we never knew what we would end up doing in that class. One session was painting, another was pottery, and one time we just talked about life. There were 10 people in the class. We became good friends, and I still keep in touch with most of them. I'm pretty sure if you showed up and participated, you would get an A. Definitely one of the easier ways to pad a grade point average, especially since it was a third-year class and my master's program only considered my grades from third and fourth year. Story 101. I took 3 geology classes over 1 or 2 weekends just to earn a few spare credit hours quickly. I passed them because of decent short-term retention of facts, But today, about 15 years later, I would not feel confident enough to distinguish between metamorphic and igneous rocks during trivia night. Story 102. I can't think of any truly useless classes that I took, so I'll tell you about the most fun ones instead. 1. An English class that focused on reading the Bible as a work of literature. I grew up Catholic but never read the Old Testament straight through, and as someone who isn't religious as an adult, I still found it quite interesting. A Vietnam War history class taught by a helicopter mechanic who served in the war. I love history, and you can't get better than someone who lived through it. Story 103 Mandarin. It is quite cool, but I forgot almost everything and did not really need it afterward, except for bragging at Asian restaurants and trying to read people's tattoos. Story 104. It was called Communicating About Ideas or something like that. I thought it was going to be some kind of debate or public speaking class, but it was more of a writing class where we didn't write about anything that mattered. The teacher was a kind of eccentric person who thought highly of herself and disliked me because I didn't go along with her nonsense. I remember she had us discussing the idea of a multiverse and called me selfish because I said I didn't want to think about different versions of myself. I wanted to believe that right now, I am the best version of myself I can be. She also thought she was quirky but was mean to a couple of students who expressed having mental health issues. I learned absolutely nothing in that class, but at least I got the credits. Story 105. Well, I guess the majority of my classes. I got a management degree but am fully technical now. The paper just got me in the door. I learned everything on the job or on my own. Story 106. Intro to American Music. I was a business major and had to take it as a part of my general education requirements. It was basically an hour of listening to folk music, then writing discussion posts about how the music made me feel. It was the worst use of my tuition dollars. Story 107. I took fishing as one of 2 physical education classes. I was the only one in the class with a fishing license, including the instructor. Everyone received tickets during our outing to fish at a state lake. I earned an A. Story 108. My major was atmospheric science with a heavy emphasis on math and science classes. One of my electives was the history of women's undergarments, exploring what women have worn through the ages. Some were pure torture. Story 109. A mandatory course titled How to Succeed in College essentially taught students to complete assignments on time, attend class, and read the textbook. This was at a community college. I was a straight-A student, so I asked my advisor if it was possible to skip that class since I clearly did not need it. She replied, "No." Story 110 Bowling. I earned a degree in engineering, but bowling was one of the options for a required elective. I received an A for being the most improved bowler in the class. Twice a week, I bowled with classmates for college credit. The professor was a man skilled at bowling but unable to become a professional bowler. A close second would be the online history of jazz class I took. The entire class consisted of listening to music and writing reflections. It was 100% online and self-paced. Story 111. Thermodynamics of Solids. It was my 4th thermodynamics class and absolutely the most difficult class I had in my entire college career. I got a solid B in it only because I treated it as a mathematics class. I have no idea what the class was about. Story 112. Walking. The professor even said that if you got less than an A in the class, there was a problem. Story 113. In Brazil, most colleges have fixed classes instead of electives, so I had to take religious studies as part of my computer science major. These were 2 separate classes, by the way. Story 114. Deaf art and cinema. I thought it would be odd, but the cinema part was actually pretty awesome. The movies usually had no words, and the only sound was from a subwoofer. My favorite one was from a first-person view, and the subwoofer sound was his heartbeat. Fast when he was running, then slower when he fell on the ice. Story 115. Casino management was fun. The first semester, all we did was learn how to play every game a casino can offer. There was no homework and no exams. The grade was 100% based on attendance. Then, for the final, we all received $15 and a bus ride to Turning Stone Casino in New York. Story 116. Business calculus. I have never used any of it practically. It seems like a lot of complex math and simplifying equations for no other purpose than to confuse. Story 117, Introduction to Music Theory or whatever it was called. I took advanced placement theory in high school, and they would not let me test out of it. Most of the class could not even read sheet music, and it was very boring. Only music majors could take the class. Story 118, I have some great courses: Evil, Advanced Evil Seminar Class, Love, Censorship and Art, Witchcraft in Early Modern Europe, History of Rock and Roll, and many more with less interesting titles that allow me to write papers on topics such as mise en place in the Lord of the Rings movies, The American Hero, and Star Trek captains. Story 119, I, a multi-instrumentalist entering a very specific 3-year non-music-related master's degree program, had to take music appreciation. General education requirements are a scam. Story 120. I had a biology seminar class where I was required to attend one seminar per week and write a paragraph about it. I did not attend any seminars and instead rewrote the paragraph based on information from websites. It was the easiest grade I ever received. Story 121. The watery part of the world. All we did was read and analyze books like Moby Dick and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Story 122. Rhetoric. We studied English grammar with an instructor who somehow managed to make a boring subject even more boring. He was a graduate student, and it was clear he taught the course only because he had to. It was one of the only 2 courses in which I received a B grade. The other was ballet. I truly deserved a lower grade as I was not very good at it, but it was beneficial for me. I was the only heterosexual male in the course and managed to get several dates with attractive female fellow students. Story 123, Philosophy of the Future. Sounded interesting but ended up being an Arthur C. Clarke literature class instead of a social science class. Story 124. All of them, my degree is relevant to my career but was entirely unnecessary to get the job. College was a complete waste of time and money. On-the-job experience has done more for me than any coursework has. I know that is not relevant to everyone's experience, but I left college with a firm belief that for me, I would have been better off getting a job straight out of high school. Story 125. Writing Studio 101 and 102 were required and a complete waste of time, especially at 8 a.m. The class content and level of competence expected were at an 8th to 9th grade level, which is low for college freshmen. Story 126. I learned and scored well in French. However, the teacher was not French, and I later realized that while I could read and write French to a good extent, I could not understand it when spoken. So it was basically not very useful. English is not my first language either, and learning it was hard enough. I just could not understand the way words are pronounced. Story 127. I forget the name, but it was a class on Excel, Word, and PowerPoint, learning how to use them. On the first day, we had a test. If you scored over 80%, you passed the class and did not have to come for the rest of the semester. Thank God I got 80%. Story 128. I was a German major at the University of Texas at Austin. Even though the university is large, the German department was small. In all the classes I took my senior year, 1/3 to 1/2 of the students were graduate students working on their Master of Arts degrees. Not only were they graded more leniently, but I was often asked to help them when they struggled. I received undergraduate credit for the classes and was graded more harshly. It was frustrating. Story 129. Archaeology. My school had a good archaeology program, but I was there for engineering and simply needed humanities credits. I value the field and find it interesting, but it took time away from my main studies, which were very difficult. The other issue was that the professor read straight from the book and did not bring anything new to the class that I could not easily discover on my own. Of course, here I am 10 years into my career, wishing I had done something more interesting than engineering like archaeology. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.